In a single night, June 12, 1937, 8 Soviet generals were executed by firing squad after a secret trial. But that was just the beginning. Within 2 years, almost 2/3 of the 1,863 officers holding general-grade ranks were arrested. Almost half were executed. At least 780 generals shot. 3 of the country's 5 highest-ranked officers killed. Stalin didn't just purge his military, he decapitated it on the eve of the largest war in human history. And what happened to Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky that summer night was only the opening act. The executions took place in the basement of Lubyanka in Moscow, where the condemned men were led one by one into a soundproofed room. To understand what unfolded after June 1937, you have to understand the machinery already in motion. The main phase of the Great Purge had begun on August 19, 1936, and would not end until November 17, 1938, a 27-month spasm of terror under NKVD Chief Nikolai Yezhov, a period so defined by his cruelty that Russians still call it the Yezhovshchina. The logic was not justice, it was arbitrary selection. A misplaced letter, a former classmate, an awkward toast at a dinner years earlier, any of it could mean a knock at the door at 3 in the morning. Official Soviet figures later recorded 681,692 executions during these years, with another 116,000 dying inside the Gulag camps. But those numbers describe the country as a whole. Inside the Red Army, the catastrophe took on a character all its own, targeted, surgical, and aimed straight at the brain of the institution. A 2024 quantitative analysis finally put hard numbers on what had long been suspected. In 1936, the Soviet armed forces counted 1,863 officers holding general-grade ranks. Within 2 years, almost 2/3 of them had been arrested. Almost half were executed outright. At least 780 of those general-grade officers were shot during the 1937-38 window, and among them sat 3 of the country's 5 highest-ranked military leaders. The very top of the pyramid, gone. But the destruction did not stop at the marshals and army commanders. Of 186 division commanders, the men who would actually lead troops into battle, more than 154 were swept away. That is over 80% of the operational backbone of the Red Army erased in roughly 24 months. A further 161 officers, about 8.6% of the general grade total, were convicted and sent to Gulag camps to die slower. 2 more, recorded coldly in the files, took their own lives during arrest. Every layer of command suffered. Regimental commanders vanished into Lubyanka basements. Staff colonels disappeared between Friday and Monday. Entire general staffs of military districts were liquidated in single sweeps. The Leningrad military district lost nearly its entire command structure in one coordinated wave of arrests that autumn. And these numbers describe only the men wearing stars on their collars. The damage to the wider officer corps, the captains, the majors, the colonels who actually held the army together, would prove even more devastating. The trials themselves were not trials in any meaningful sense. They were closed, unpublicized, and frequently concluded inside a single afternoon. Tukhachevsky's secret tribunal lasted hours, not days. The defendants arrived already broken. Confessions extracted through beatings, sleep deprivation, and threats against wives and children held in adjoining cells. Tukhachevsky's confession, recovered decades later, was visibly spattered with his own blood. The verdict was written before the proceedings opened. The sentence was almost always death, carried out within hours of the gavel, sometimes in the same building where the trial had just ended. Compare this to the modern language of corporate purges, where executives are dismissed with severance packages and press releases. Stalin's version meant a windowless room, a single shot to the base of the skull, and an unmarked grave outside Moscow. Family members were often arrested in the same operation, sent to camps as wives and children of enemies of the people. 20 years later, in 1957, the Soviet Supreme Court itself was forced to confront what had been done. In a series of rehabilitation rulings, it declared the convictions of Tukhachevsky and dozens of his fellow officers baseless, obtained, in the court's own words, under physical violence. The men were innocent. The trials were fabrications. The signatures on the confessions had been written by hands that had already been smashed. And yet, terrible as the process was for each individual officer, the true horror only becomes visible when you step back and measure the whole. Across the entire Red Army, roughly 30,000 to 35,000 officers were removed between 1937 and 1939, arrested, shot, sent to camps, or expelled in disgrace. That figure represents approximately half of the entire Soviet officer corps. More than 25,000 officers were officially disgraced or stripped from the rolls. Half the professional military leadership of the largest army on earth erased in 24 months by its own government in peacetime. To grasp how unprecedented this was, set it against the most notorious political bloodletting in the Western imagination. Nazi Germany's Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, the event that consolidated Hitler's grip on the SA and the German state, killed approximately 85 people. 85. Stalin's purge killed at least 780 generals alone and tens of thousands of officers beneath them. The ratio is not close. It is not even the same order of magnitude. No Western democracy in the 20th century did anything remotely comparable to its own military. No other dictatorship, before or since, has voluntarily destroyed half of its own officer class, while no foreign army was at its border. The Soviet Union did this to itself. And it did so while German rearmament was accelerating, while Japanese forces probed the Manchurian frontier at Khalkhin Gol, while every intelligence report crossing Stalin's desk warned that a continental war was coming. The men who would have to fight that war were being shot in cellars by the thousand. Then, on June 22, 1941, the bill came due. Operation Barbarossa hurled more than 3 million German soldiers across the Soviet frontier, and the Red Army that met them was no longer the army Tukhachevsky had built. Its division commanders had been promoted from captain to general in 18 months. Its staff officers had never run an exercise above battalion level. Entire armies surrendered in encirclements at Białystok, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Over 4 million Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the first 6 months alone. Historians have argued for decades that Stalin's purge created the command vacuum that made those catastrophes possible. The Soviet Union held numerical superiority in tanks, in aircraft, in men. What it lacked was anyone left who knew how to use them. The marshals who might have stopped the Wehrmacht at the border were already in unmarked graves outside Moscow, victims of the leader they had served. The Great Purge of the Red Army stands as perhaps the most self-destructive act ever committed by a major power on the eve of an existential war. Stalin's paranoia did not strengthen the Soviet state. It transformed a rising professional army into a leaderless mass that would pay in blood for years on the road from Brest to Stalingrad and back to Berlin. 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war that followed. How many of them might have lived if the men shot in 1937 had been standing on the border in 1941? The question haunts every archive.